How you going? My name's Matt and I like to make things. Today we move into the next step of testing some epoxy and we will pull the two different products out of the mould. Now they've been in there for near enough to 2 weeks. Now there's a reason for leaving it that long, even though cure times are quoted at 5 to 7 days. I have a sample here of what you can do to epoxy that has been left for 5 days. This was trimmed off the side of a serving board with a table saw. It's 5mm thick on one side and maybe 2mm thick on the other, because it's a HDPE mould, so slightly tapered to knock it out. This was soft enough, as you can see, for me to tie knots in it. A week later, if we try to bend it, it snaps. So in fairness, leaving these products to cure for the full 2 weeks means they are properly set, and so when we demold, there's not going to have any impact on their behaviour or strength, and they're not going to bend and shift and all of that. Prior to doing these tests, I had poured some samples of 3 different products and then polished them up a bit and chucked them in the sun. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll have seen some of the progress with that, and what we've got here is a sample of what maybe 10 to 12 weeks in the sun will do. This one here is a product called Epoxy. The brand doesn't exist anymore, so I'm quite happy to talk about it. This was a very cheap product. And as you can see, the price reflects in how yellow it went. It actually went this yellow in about 72 hours. It was pretty quick. The other two premium brands, this one $55, $60 a litre, this one $35, poured at the same time in the same conditions and treated the same way as the Epoxy, and you can see clarity's pretty good. Certainly surprisingly good given how harsh Australian conditions can be, and given that I didn't spend a lot of time polishing them, you would consider these results acceptable. We're dealing with a plastic, it hasn't really yellowed off. I think that moving forward I will do another UV test with multiple brands, but I will wait until spring and then expose them to summer sun, and we'll see how they cope under those conditions. For now, we'll move on to the exciting part, which is pulling this apart. What I will say is the Lucy Clear and the Oakfield both degassed reasonably well. I came back and checked about an hour and a half after the pour, and what I found was the Lucy Clear was pretty much bubble free. There's a few around the edges, but with a torch shining in there, really struggled to find anything visible bubble wise. The Oakfield wasn't quite that clear, but it seemed to be degassing reasonably well. Given that the edge of the timber was sealed, as per my previous video, with 3 or 4 coats over an hour or so, I'm actually surprised with how much air still came out of the timber. My current thinking, and that may well shift as we go through this process, but my current thinking is you probably need to do multiple seal coats depending on the type of timber you're using to prevent bubbles coming out of the wood and impacting the epoxy. Because the epoxy moves slowly, sort of percolates as it cures, what can happen, and we will see as we open this up, is the bubbles will move away from the edge through the epoxy. And then you will have bubbles over here and here and here, rather than along the edge of the timber. To be clear, this is only a problem if you are doing clear or transparent coloured epoxy. If you're doing a solid colour, the bubbles are not going to matter, they're not going to be visible, and as per my original comments, the strength of a straight pour, in my opinion, is still superior to sealing the edges. Perhaps the gap between the strengths is not as big as I think, but that's how I feel about it. So, pulling it apart time. Now, what we can see here is I used a lot of silicone. We had no leaks, which is excellent. That's what we want. Does make it a little bit tougher to pull apart, but worth the effort. Now, before we actually take it off, you can already see the light coming through, and there's bubbles around the edges. I think the silicone may carry a little bit of air, or perhaps certainly hold it. Both brands here have noticeable stuff around the edges. So if bubbles are going to be a problem, make sure you have an allowance to cut off or route or something where the edges of your sealing material will be. Using tape and a smaller amount of silicone may well reduce the amount of bubbles based on your sealed edge. So that was pretty easy to come apart. I believe that is a testament of this surface and the mold release that I use. We'll put that there. That is the Oakfield. Have a look at that. You can see there is bubbles on the lower portion, and I am almost certain most of that air has come out of the timber, and that the sealing job that I did was inadequate. I don't think the product is that bad at bubble release. Now we look at the Lucy Clear. A couple things are apparent. Firstly, less air. Two parts to that. The initial degassing of this product was superior to the Oakfield. Secondly, somehow I believe the sealing of the timber edge was better. Whether that's a reflection of the product or something in the process, I don't know. But when we put the two together, there is an obvious difference in the amount of air left now that it is cured. Again, this is not necessarily a major problem if you're doing a solid colour that is not going to be see-through. What I would note is between doing the pour and today, I've watched a few videos on YouTube around similar tests. These are Australian-made products, and in comparison to the US-made products in the tests that I saw, these perform about the same. This would be close to the same as maybe 8 or 10 products made in America without using a vacuum chamber. And this would be obviously superior to that. What that means is the Australian product is, based on what we can see here and what I have seen online, at worst equal to international product, and potentially better if you have access to a vacuum chamber, or you do a better job of sealing the timber. And again, I'll come back to that. I think the amount of air we're seeing here is not entirely the result of the product itself. And if we look at this product here, I don't know if we can come in close on that. That's a straight pour with no timber other than the little chip, and there is obvious air bubbles in that. This is a product that costs nearly twice as much as the Oakfield and hasn't performed that much better. The next thing we're going to do is run these through some machinery and see how they behave. So we will get to that. Right, so we've tidied them up, run them through the thicknesser. Most guys aren't going to have a thicknesser at home, I don't think, and so it's a pretty harsh test. I have a helical head, so straight cutters, multiple cutters rather than 2 single blades. It has still shown some tear out for both brands. You would expect that given how harsh that machine is, and this is the passing edge, so it went in timber first, as you saw. The outside edge, or the last edge, is chipping off. I don't think you will find an epoxy that won't do that. It may behave better at the 5 or 6 day mark where it's semi-cured but still a bit soft, but I would expect any brand to do this, and in actual fact, in my experience, they do. The surface otherwise is actually quite nice. You would still need to do a reasonable amount of sanding to get it looking perfect, but most guys will use a router and a large spinning cutter, you know, maybe 40 or 50 mil, and that will probably give you a nicer finish. Ultimately, whatever you're doing, if you take to it with a cutting tool, you're going to be sanding again. That is enough for that particular aspect of the test. The next thing we're going to do is closer to what most guys will do in a DIY setting, and that is use a half round router bit. This is quite small, 6 or 8 mil I think, to tidy up the edges and give you a nice soft round edge. That looks nice on a serving board. Not my favourite thing for perhaps a tabletop. I prefer a square edge, but you know, that's just an opinion. So next thing we're going to do is run this around the edges. This will be a closer to the DIY, you know, having a crack at home sort of situation. Right, so ran the router around the edges. It's pretty messy. It took me longer to clean up the mess than it did to actually do the edges. Both of them have performed as I would expect. I've got a nice clean edge. You could start at 240 grit sandpaper, and there's no tear out. This is as good as it gets as far as a router, so pretty happy with the result. Not surprised. I've used both of these brands before. They machine well. The next thing would be to sand them and sand them some more, and then a bit more sanding, and then polish to make them look like glass. That would be pretty boring to watch, so that will happen off camera, and I'll come back at a date in the future with some results. I do have a few things in the coming weeks that will hold this process up, but certainly I will get to that. What I would say is I'm also going to do a separate test with our timber. I believe the Oakfield product will do better than it has here, and so I want to do that. As noted in my original sort of introductory video, Carmen from Oakfield sent me more than 1.5 litres, so I will use some of that product and do a separate pour and see how the bubble extraction goes without the timber variable. Certainly it is a product that I have used before, and this is, I'm a little bit surprised actually with how much the bubbles have shown up here, and that will become more apparent once the polish is done. Lucy Clear, I'll continue to do tests on it alongside, and we'll see how it looks. We'll also look at how finishes behave on them, not so much to promote anything in particular, but just for your information. When I do the Oakfield test, I should have product from Elichem or Resonate based in Western Australia, and I will parallel test the Oakfield against it without timber, and again we will get to see how they behave. In the meantime, thank you for your time. I hope I'm helping you make some sort of decision about what product you may or may not use, and do feel free to ask me a question if there is something I've missed or something you don't understand. If you would like to subscribe, that would be excellent. In the meantime, have yourself a fabulous day, and we'll catch up soon.